justify it with in-game reasons, that somehow it's too expensive for this vast intergalactic empire that drains worlds of their resources to manufacture.
Rather than bringing recognizable weapons back just for the sake of fan service, one of the most iconic
conserve its ammo until the encounter with the Prophet at the end of the level. However, this limits you to only one weapon, which you need to carry with you added to your car throughout the level. This is quite a good reference to the first game, as it brings back a weapon in a way that makes sense, although I can imagine people were disappointed. It would be remiss to talk about Half-Life 2 without covering the physics. Half-Life 2's physics, and now Half-Life 2 as a title in 2004 was known for its gameplay actually incentivizes movement with things such as Halo 2 is kind of a grind. Before closing off the section on gameplay, there's one important thing that needs to be addressed. It's like that thing, you know, where you have an empty map and it's kind of cordoned off and you can't leave, and then you get to play it online and then other people are able to join the same map and fight you? Yeah, that. Multiplayer is an important part of Halo 2. In fact, the multiplayer in Halo 2 was revolutionary. Halo was never even originally supposed to be a multiplayer game. Offline and system link multiplayer was a small feature that was almost cut from Halo 1, and only made it in at the last minute. It was only a few members of Bungie who sued for the addition of multiplayer close to launch. There was no Xbox Live, and hauling down 4 Xboxes for system link play is impractical for most players. Most people only played 4-player split screen locally. If only they knew. Multiplayer was also almost cut from Halo 2 as well, but they knew better. Bungie originally wanted some massive ground war type game mode like Star Wars Battlefront, but they scaled it down to similar levels to Halo 1's multiplayer. It was still revolutionary nonetheless. That isn't something I use lightly. Many aspects of modern multiplayer games were invented in Halo 2. It launched Xbox Live. It's really responsible for a lot of the negative and positive of online gaming in 2021. This was the first time most Halo fans got to play online against a full lobby of 16 players. It was the first time for many people that online play was widely accessible to a console audience. Halo 2 got so much right, it's ridiculous. And it got things right that modern games are still failing at. Halo 2 accompanied the development of Microsoft's Tsunami suite of online features. These were effectively developed by Bungie, in tandem with Microsoft. Some of these features include in-game friends lists, which show what game they're playing, in-game clans, parties and party chat, proximity voice chat, lobbies, matchmaking and playlists. Yes, all of those things were invented in Halo 2. You can speak about the negative effect it had on shooters all you like. There is not one online game on PC or console today that does not use at least some of these features. Matchmaking has its downsides, doubtlessly, but it's good for competitive gaming. It's accessible and it groups players together based on connection or some other factors, like skill-based matchmaking, who otherwise may not have met. Yes, it can limit freedom by compartmentalizing different players into specific playlists, as opposed to a server browser which would give them more freedom. But Halo 2 did have an alternative, custom games, where you have the freedom to make up whatever wild game modes you like. Matchmaking is necessary for a competitive ranked game. It's telling that every major PC game has this feature. CSGO, TF2, Rainbow Six Siege, Overwatch, the list expands eternally. Even server-based PC games use some Halo 2 features like proximity chat, for example. Games like Rust, PUBG, Arma, Ark, the list again expands eternally. Every single online game has a lobby or party system. In Halo 2 you would party up with people after a game and continue to search for future games with them. Halo 2's online suite is ubiquitous. It has been adopted almost globally to some extent. Halo 2 obviously didn't invent competitive ranking, but it was an important step in competitive gaming. It used a competitive ranking system popularized in chess known as the ELO ranking system, whereby, in short, you gain points for a win and lose points, which I'll be using interchangeably with XP, for a loss. It wasn't until Halo 3 that true skill was invented. So Halo 2 just used raw ELO. The size of your win depends on the rank of your enemies compared to you. If your enemy is a higher rank than you, then the XP gained from a win is higher, while the XP lost from losing a game is lower. If you're against an enemy of lower rank, it's the other way around. XP gained from a win is lower, while the amount of XP lost from a game loss is greater. It represented this system as a 1 to 50 on the side of your player card. There was a point you passed in the 30s where you could not drop below your current rank. Instead, you had a progress bar where you were set back every time you lost a match. There were some issues with this system. For one, in ELO it's possible to lose a rank even when you win the game. It's just if you don't win by enough, you D-rank. And only wins mattered when counting your rank. In truth, people treated rank like an RPG character you level up over time. Maybe it's why COD 4 was so successful in actually making that their leveling system. Halo 2's ranking was grueling and cruel. The people at the top were almost exclusively cheaters and boosters, although there were some people who legitimately lived and breathed the game. Halo 2 had skill-based matchmaking, and as such, had many of the same issues that most modern games with it have. It wasn't until Halo 3 that a proper solution was found, or at least one that is better than most of what you see today. It's also worth noting the explosion of competitive play. That all sounds fine, but at the end of the day, it is true. Not all of the aspects of Halo 2's online suite were rosy. It was basically the prompt for paid online services on console. You could justify it back in 2004. These were features nobody else had. But now, well, the idea is far more ubiquitous and has far less justification for itself. Running online games is expensive, and you have various solutions. One is to just let your fans host it themselves. Let them foot the bill for their own servers. But consoles want to offer a service. Really, paid online serves the same purpose in funding the live updates for a game that microtransactions do. It's especially insulting when you have both, however. Halo 2 really was the first live game. The game was updated regularly with new maps, features, and hotfixes. All of the map packs were released for free. Xbox Live was essentially your subscription for that service. It was also responsible for the genesis of much of the addicting Skinner box design that is so common in live service games. Think of the medals. Now, Halo certainly was not the first game with an announcer, but they pushed it a step further. You now get a shiny medal celebrating your special achievement. It pops up there above the kill feed. It's clearly considered even more important information than anything that's actually within the kill feed. This tiny audiovisual cue is engineered specifically to produce a dopamine hit. And now it's in every game. They tie it to everything. Think of the COD hit markers and the satisfying sound accompanying them. Think of the pop-up and the accompanying sting which follows even the most minor of achievements in any modern game. Bungie is still the masters of this. Just look at Destiny. Obviously Halo 2 didn't invent this, but it's an important step. That's not to rag on Halo medals. Jeff Steitzer delivered an awesome and memorable performance. Now, what about Half-Life 2's multiplayer? Half-Life 2 Deathmatch? Well, it was kind of fun. I mean, it was an entertaining, chaotic mess. One good thing about it is it being server-based. Server-based games offer the player base so much more freedom, even with the tiniest of population. A server-based game can still survive. It's been years since this game came out, but you can still find matches. Sure, it can never be a competitive game, and some of the social experiences are lost, but at least you can go back and play it today. The same can't be said for Halo 2. The servers were shut down over 10 years ago. Ironically, the only reliable way to play online until Master Chief Collection was through the version that was divorced from the Xbox console. It was the PC version which gave users the freedom to mod to their heart's content. It's that freedom that allowed the game to live on, even in a diminished capacity. Halo 2 may not be the star of the show like it once was, but it used to be something. It used to matter. But the fact of the matter is, Half-Life 2's multiplayer was never the star of the show. It was picked last for the team. It took a long ride on the short bus. Half-Life 2's multiplayer was never the main attraction. It's not something fans of the genre hold up as a holy icon to the Joker, patron saint of video games. But that's because it wasn't the only source multiplayer. It was really an afterthought. It was never really a fair battle from the beginning. No, the real comparison is with Halo 2 and the various Source games multiplayers. That means Counter-Strike Source, Day of Defeat, Team Fortress 2, Left 4 Dead, and the list goes on ad infinitum. Like I touched on, much of the strength of Half-Life 2 was really the strength of the Source engine. Half-Life 2 was a tech demo. Valve now dominates multiplayer gaming on PC, not entirely, but they have a firm grip. You see, the success of Valve isn't even a testament to how good they are at making games. It's how good their values are. They made an easy-to-use engine and gave users complete control to do whatever the hell they want. Halo has custom games. Half-Life has Garry's Mod. When you put it that way, it's not even fair. Valve ultimately won the online multiplayer market by giving their players freedom to play their way. Valve didn't even make Gmod, but they gave Garry the freedom to make it. And then they supported the game when it became popular. This is an inherent flaw in closed-off platform and game design. DRM-heavy platforms with major limits on player freedom will always lose out in the long run compared to moddable games, which give players freedom over their own servers, their own mods, and their own experiences, even if it means being less approachable in the short term and less accessible. Halo is only just starting to get proper mod support and a custom games browser now. To be fair, Bungie did make a legitimate effort to bring user-generated content over to console, something very few other developers were attempting at the time, or even try to implement to this very day. It seems that there is a bottom-up kind of pressure for more freedom in gaming, but there is also certainly a top-down pressure in favour of limiting freedoms. Valve doesn't really abandon their games either. Well, they do, but look at TF2's support versus Halo 3's support. Both games came out in 2007. TF2 players complain about no major updates since 2017. But remember, that's 10 full years of support, not to mention the ongoing bug fixes and yearly events to this day. Halo 3 basically got 3 years. Take it or leave it. Because that's all it was designed to last for. Past that point, no new maps, no major fixes, nothing. It was replaced by Halo Reach, which was itself later replaced by its successor. Halo 3 was a good, or a product, while TF2 is a service. I could go on about this all day, but ultimately, I'm just going to digress further from the actual games. It's far more of a difference in philosophy of the company running these games than it is the design of the original games themselves. It's clear that the Halo series has been moving towards this live service model in the past few years. It's hardly a new thing. There's more to these games than just the gameplay. I'll just devote a bit of time to cut through the middle by talking about the soundtracks. Half-Life's soundtrack is iconic, most iconic being the Valve theme, known properly as Hazardous Environments. It doesn't exactly have a memorable melody, and certainly doesn't follow the rules for a main theme, but boy if it isn't iconic. The strength of Half-Life's soundtrack lies in its atmosphere. The main theme builds such suspense with its droning over 2 notes, with a slow build-up of percussion. It fits the clandestine hidden science facility atmosphere so well. Half-Life's soundtrack is very electronic, and it fits in with the production of the time. It really sounds like something out of its time period in 2004, which is a good thing, by the way. It almost feels like an electronic dance album or something. Many of the tracks are remixes of previous tracks or tracks from Half-Life 1. A significant share of the tracks are very action-driven and percussive. It helps drive the story forward. You're on the run from an evil empire and you just have to keep moving. The music suits the gameplay to a T. Triage at Dawn is another notable track. It sounds like some classic military vigil with the horns playing, but then it kind of has an alien undertone with the very electronic sounding lower end. This evokes some familiar cultural ideas about military and honor, but then subverts it, reminding us how alien this world truly is, how alien this world has become. Many of the tracks also sound quite dark and dreary. Again, it all goes back to atmosphere. Atmosphere is hard to quantify, but you'll be able to recognize it effortlessly when you play the game. These songs reinforce the post-apocalyptic setting. They paint a portrait of just how destitute humanity has become. Half-Life's music evokes elements of horror, action, and electronica to craft a kind of soundscape. It adds so very much to the campaign experience. Make no mistake, Kelly Bailey is a genius. Now what about Halo's soundtrack? By Marty O'Donnell and Michael Salvatore? Where do I begin? This was clearly a collaborative effort, with multiple people of all sorts of musical background. It featured many other contributions besides the main composers, O'Donnell and Salvatore. This includes celebrities such as Steve Vai, John Mayer, Incubus, Breaking Benjamin, and even more. This is part of the hype surrounding the game. They had the budget from Microsoft to make the game a cultural phenomenon. Halo did have this kind of Hollywood quality about it. Its marketing was insane. They also had celebrity voice actors like Ron Perlman and Keith David. Halo 2 had all these celebrity cameos on the soundtrack, but was it all style and no substance? No, it most certainly was not all style. These flashier moments are backed up by an incredibly solid musical foundation courtesy of O'Donnell and Salvatore. The O'Donnell and Salvatore team was one that had been working together for many years before Bungie. They clearly had a creative chemistry at the time that paid off. O'Donnell came from a far more compositional background, going to music school and having a solid knowledge of music theory. Salvatore came from more of a rock band background. Both composers were fond of progressive rock, growing up in the ideal time period of the early 1970s. Halo's soundtrack is quite broad and diverse, covering everything from classical cinematic score to rock to ambient and electronic to almost world music inspired tribal percussion tracks. Halo truly does have music to suit every mood. Halo's soundtrack is iconic. The main theme starts off unlike anything else you've heard in games. That Gregorian monk chant bringing you into a lull. Martin O'Donnell was given the words ancient, epic and mysterious as inspiration to write this melody. In fact, many of the tracks in Halo are based in the mode of Dorian, which is used in many classic hymns and definitely has ancient and epic connotations in the Western psyche. This monk chant evokes both religious and sci-fi themes, fitting the world perfectly, basically building the world of Halo. Following the main monk theme is the driving Celtic percussion, and then the strings. It's already blended so many styles this early on into the theme. The string section is the most classically composed. It starts with a simple interval, in this case an entire octave, and then continues to build on that. There is an incredible amount of dramatic tension produced by having an interval be greater than an octave. Interesting fact, the woman crying over the background is actually not a woman at all. It's Marty O'Donnell, the composer. Halo has an amazing soundtrack, and the truth is Halo 2 has the best soundtrack out of all of the Halo games. It has the same main theme as Halo 1, just with Steve Vai jamming over it, and it works? How about the moment you steal the Heretic Banshee and then all of a sudden you're hit by that vaguely Spanish sounding rock jam? That was the Incubus track. What about some of the less appreciated tracks? Ancient Machine produces such a thick horror atmosphere. It's almost like all of the sounds are actually produced by things in the game. There is some unearthly electronic rhythm, very evocative of the ancient malignant machines hidden below your feet. It builds a world beyond what you immediately see. Then there are the ghostly wails over the top of it, like the spectres of the slain enemies haunting the battlefield. A few of the tracks have a really groovy bassline as well. You can see the rock background with tracks like Flawed Legacy. Many of the tracks also sound like military vigils or a choir in celebration of some religious event. The ambient tracks like High Charity serve as beautiful moments of respite in between battles. The beauty of Halo's soundtrack is its dynamic nature. It's so adaptive. It knows when to take the back seat. It was Martin O'Donnell's belief that pieces should not play more than once and continue on repeat, as was common at the time. Halo's adaptive audio was very advanced for the time. For example, the music track that plays in a cutscene would depend on the point you were in the previous track when the cutscene triggered. The music knew when to stand back and when to take control.
Me, inside your head, now.
How much time was left?
You don't want to know. Me, inside your head, now.
How much time was left?
You don't want to know.
Cairo, this is an Ember class.
Ultimately, you can argue about the systems and technical aspects of music all day, but what really matters is the emotional equity, as Marty O'Donnell would have put it, that the music has for you. Where were you in your life when you first heard it? Because you're inevitably going to associate it with the people and places you were near to in your life. Ultimately, the best soundtrack is going to be the one you have the most fond memories of. But how do they compare on things such as diversity, on technology, composition, recognizability? I think Halo wins. Kelly Bailey is a genius, but nothing really compares to what was produced by Martin O'Donnell's and Michael Salvatore's contribution. It's easily up there with the greatest of the video game soundtrack. Gameplay is how you experience the world. The music is what builds it. But what is it that pulls you through the world? It's the narrative. I won't give a plot summary because I respect my viewers' intelligence and time. I'm not Dobson, I'm not going to unnecessarily inflate this. This video assumes you have some knowledge of how both of these games play out. Rest assured, there will be spoilers. Although it really shouldn't matter, they're both over 16 years old and like $10 on Steam. First things first, the setting of both games. Half-Life 2 has a near-future dystopian setting, following the events of Half-Life 1, where a resonance cascade event, caused by Gordon Freeman himself, that being you, unleashed denizens of alien flora and fauna into the Black Mesa science facility. The military is sent to clean up the disaster and basically, everything's gone to shit. The game ends when the Nihilanth, the Teletubby King mind controller, hold on, I'll check the wiki, supreme leader of Zen, is defeated by Gordon. Gordon is then taken into custody by the G-Man. Half-Life 2 is set around 20 years later when the G-Man wakes you up again. It's based in a fictional Eastern European locale. Like I alluded to earlier with the music, the atmosphere is thick. They really drive home the darker aspects of the world. The oceans are all dried up, there's a field stopping all human reproduction. Some of the environmental details are a bit on the nose, like the empty playground with the sound of kids echoing in the distance. The environmental storytelling is quite good. You're given exposition on the situation in City 17 through points of interest in the world, such as Dr. Breen's Big Brother-esque monologues or the hushed conversations among the human inhabitants. The Metro Cops also have an inhuman appearance. There are no cutscenes whatsoever, so everything is told to you. Many of the creatures that came from Zen during Half-Life 1 are now out in the world. They're refugees, on the run from the powerful Combine Empire. The game opens with a tram ride. Oh yes, you gotta love the fan service. But this was a bait and switch, you see. It ends after just a few seconds and then you're free. See, it's nothing like that boring tram ride in Half-Life 1. It sets you free to discover the world. Well, not really. Half-Life 2's opening is really no better than the tram opening in Half-Life 1. You're still in a set path, basically directly shown the world in a linear sequence. You're still very directed. If anything, it almost feels like it takes longer for you to get into the action in Half-Life 2 than in Half-Life 1. Not to mention the fact that you're being guided through the early game by NPCs, versus Half-Life 1 where you're left on your own to figure it out and find all the weapons yourself. It really invalidates that point about freedom by putting you into a second tram ride anyway through the Citadel at the end of the game. The Half-Life 1 opening was enigmatic and mysterious. It set up this top secret science facility. It gave you brief glimpses of the crazy goings-on and wild experimental technology inside this hidden base. The Half-Life 2 opening tells you how bad the Combine is. It creates a picture of the grip on planet Earth and allows you to fill in the context clues. What use does the Citadel ride have? That the Combine are still bad? By this point, we've already fought and taken down Striders and gunships. We know what the Combine is all about. We know how much power they have. Why was this ride narratively necessary? Halo 2 has a far future alien war setting. There was a war between all of mankind and a bright, shiny and fabulous conglomeration of aliens known as the Covenant. Escaping the Covenant, Master Chief landed on Halo and tried to figure out what it was with the help of his VTuber assistant Cortana. Deep within the greasy bowels of the Halo, the Flood was released, a parasite which eats all living organisms in its wake. As it turns out, Halo was a device built by ancient aliens meant to kill all living organisms to stop the spread of the Flood. Talk about cutting off the nose to spite the face. It ends with Master Chief blowing up the ship he came in on, thus destroying Halo. Halo 2 opens with a cutscene, not of you, but of this random alien dude. Turns out he was the head honcho, the big kahuna, and he failed by letting Halo get destroyed. Why are you showing me so much of this alien dude? I don't care. Where's the chief? Ah, here he is. The chief's story perfectly contrasts the Arbiters as he's being celebrated as a hero, but alas, the celebrations were premature as Earth is under attack. Halo is far more of a space opera or epic tone. It has a larger scale. It's more of a grand adventure spanning many different locales. You really see a radically different side of the story when you ultimately play as the Arbiter in Halo 2, but it feels a wee bit disjointed. It was marketed as the final battle for Earth. It was meant to be the last stand of humanity, and the game genuinely opens with these stakes. But before long, you're out gallivanting across the universe. Why are we on another Halo again? Not to mention the Arbiter missions. The introduction of the Covenant and its structure, its hierarchy, was a radically different breath of fresh air. It kind of blindsides you with the alien political intrigue and the arc of not only the Arbiter, but the whole elite race. You're also in the boots of a far more talkative character, one who's actually a part of the story rather than a witness to the story like Master Chief. Or to be fair, as Master Chief, you do kind of trigger through gameplay some of the pivotal events. The art and the sound are really stellar though. The Forerunners are just as mysterious as they were in Halo 1. You see their stone dwellings and their gondolas and can only wonder what they were for. High Charity is also wonderfully realised. It's very similar in design to the tower from Destiny. You can see with all the peaceful gardens, it's the kind of opulent place that the elite tiers of the Covenant hierarchy inhabit. You can see why they're called the elites. They really do live in the lap of luxury. There's also some great environmental storytelling. You get to watch the schism between the elites and the brutes unfold before your eyes as you watch them battle. Four-way NPC battles between the elites, the brutes, the flood, and your marines. There's also this part in Quarantine Zone with the Sentinel Factory. You see it there at the beginning sending out sentinels, then it gets shot down and you can walk through its remains further down the track. One issue with the Arbiter levels is the degree of separation between you and him. It's harder to feel like your in-game actions have purpose when you already know what Halo is. He also has a full backstory and history which you, as a player, do not share. It's harder to empathize with the Arbiter. You don't feel any reverence or respect for the Prophets when he does. You just see him kneeling before the bad guys. You're actively working against yourself. For half of the game, you're actively working against the Covenant. For the other half, you spend a good chunk of that actively supporting the Covenant. The Arbiter is not an icon or representation of the player either. He's a character who is very interesting, but ultimately divorced from the goals of the player. It does feel good later on when the elites realize the truth. At first, it's just jarring seeing the game world through the view of the Arbiter. One criticism I feel it would be fair to level at both games is the frantic pacing. Halo Combat Evolved is set on the one Halo ring for almost the entire game. The mystery slowly unfolds around you as you discover what Halo is. Halo 2 changes locations every 2 missions. It's trying to fit so much into its brief runtime, as evidenced by the cliffhanger ending. It's clearly more than the studio could handle. There was meant to be basically an entire third act where the Ark is on Earth, and it's very heavily implied that Forerunners are humans, or at least are related to them. Halo 2 never settles on a solid plotline. Half-Life 2 suffers from a similar issue, albeit to a lesser extent. Half-Life 2's story doesn't feel as rushed. It is still quickly throwing out old ideas rather than following a subtle progression. First it's a horror game, then you're on a road trip, then you're storming a prison with some alien buddies who are now your friends all of a sudden. It feels like a string of novelties with a plot to drag you through it rather than an adventure. Another issue with Half-Life 2, which I feel Halo does not particularly suffer from, is its jarring departure from the original. Halo 2 feels like a natural progression and evolution of the Covenant. They expand on their culture and hierarchy and introduce new alien creatures that make sense as a part of this civilization. Half-Life basically goes from some covert scientific base with questionable ethics, clandestine operations and conspiracies, to an all-out totalitarian dystopia. No, the Nihilanth did not warn us about the Combine. Rather, Valve built its brand new enemy faction that had nothing to do with Half-Life 1, partially around this cryptic message. The Combine are like nothing from Half-Life 1, and they now make up the vast majority of enemy combatants. For most of Half-Life 1, the majority of your enemies were alien creatures from Zen, but there were a small number of Marines, and the number of Marines you fought would increase over time. Speaking of Zen, it's basically been discarded in the sequel. The HEC U-Marines are squad-based and relatively smart opponents for 1998. The Combine are just varying degrees of masked dudes that point and shoot. They have no character and they're not very smart, they just use human weapons, besides of course the pulse rifle. The enemy factions of Half-Life 2 are a step down from their predecessor, while the enemies of Halo 2 are more of a natural progression of what you fought in Halo 1. The Prophets were very clearly a natural part of the Covenant. They were actually planned to be a part of Halo 1, albeit as elites in fancy dress. One very noteworthy aspect of Half-Life's presentation is that it never breaks the first-person perspective at all. Halo breaks it quite regularly. Half-Life basically has title cards for each chapter and that's it. Halo has cutscenes to mark important moments. In the main trilogy, Master Chief is basically silent outside of cutscenes, while Gordon Freeman is quiet all of the time. I think maintaining first-person perspective is absolutely laudable. It never breaks your immersion. You inhabit Gordon and are witnessing everything as him. The facial animations are absolutely amazing and hold up to this very day. You are just a random physicist in Half-Life, and yet you can become the savior of mankind. It presents a strong theme of individual empowerment and adds more relatability to Gordon. You feel like you could be him. With that suit, in Half-Life it's about being the right man in the wrong place. In Halo, it's about your luck. One thing that's admirable about the Halo trilogy is the philosophy of never doing anything in a cutscene that would be better off done by the player in-game. You see so many flashy action scenes in games that never line up with what the player can actually do when they're playing. Half-Life, of course, never has to worry about this, given it has no cutscenes, or at least the cutscenes don't actually cut away. While this is impressive, it is also problematic. The game treats you like an active participant. It tries to make you feel powerful and important in the world, but falls flat. It's just awkward when they're talking at you with no response.
Man, a few words, aren't you?
Were you talking to Gordon or to me? Doesn't matter, I'm not going to respond. Now with cutscenes, while you do sacrifice the purity of a wholly first-person experience, the dialogue does feel less awkward. Master Chief still responds when people are talking to him.
Master Chief, defend this station.
Yes, sir. I need a weapon.
Right this way.
He isn't much of a character, on purpose. The cutscenes make the dialogue feel more natural and not like the NPCs are just practicing a speech in the mirror. There's an awkward pause between every line. In Half-Life 1 it worked because you barely spoke to another human. You saw everything happen around you. Half-Life 2 was a story-driven, character-driven game. Speaking of the characters and dialogue, so many of the characters and so much of the dialogue feels like in-jokes and references. It makes me think of a Family Guy cutaway gag. Holy friggin' crap, Gordon, this is like that time you burnt my casserole. No way, Gordon, this is like that time I promised you a beer. That's the issue with bringing back NPCs as actual characters. Again, Halo 2 did this once with Sergeant Johnson at the beginning of the game, plus a few one-liners throughout the story. Yes, it's enjoyable to fans of the game, but it's silly and makes the characters feel cheaper. They're not these cool characters who actually fight alongside you. They're not actually part of the world. They're not people trying to survive. They're just vessels for exposition. But at least we know that Johnson met Master Chief. When did Barney meet Gordon? Unless he's one of the security guards. In which case, which one was he? But anyway, I'm fairly sure I remember Barney's whole day at the office. He saw a glimpse of Gordon on his tram ride and then never saw him again. How did he know the crowbar was Gordon's favourite weapon? He never saw Gordon with a crowbar once. Nobody did. Is it even Gordon's favourite weapon? Or is it just the only one he had handy at the time? It's the only one he could have found in a science facility. Do you know what would have made sense? Getting that crowbar from a Combine supply closet. Why does everyone remember every step of Gordon's journey from Half-Life 1? It's very clearly one you do mostly alone, making some brief alliances along the way. Were they informed by the G-Man? Where did the cult of Gordon come from? Especially among humans. It makes sense for the Vortigaunts, who are no longer under mind control. They have this kind of psychic sense. Gordon's actions had a very immediate effect on them. I know where the cult of Master Chief came from. You destroyed Halo and have many records of your various feats in Halo 1. You have those cameras recording you at your medal presentation ceremony. It's pretty easy to fill in the blanks between the end of Halo 1 and the start of Halo 2. Not to mention the fact that you're a 7-foot tall Spartan super soldier. It makes sense that the NPCs around you idolize you. It doesn't make as much sense in Half-Life 2. In Half-Life 1, you're not special. You're just a survivor. You were just lucky enough to be wearing the suit. There are hints that forces outside of your control may have been guiding your path, but for all intents and purposes, you made it out of Black Mesa. No one saw you do it though. You were only briefly assisted by friendly NPCs at different points. Maybe Barney remembers the crowbar so well because it's what I used to sputter his brains against the wall. Halo 2 is consistent with Halo 1. You're a superpowered super soldier, the savior of humanity, maybe a bit over the top, but that's how it's presented. Half-Life 2 is like this as well, where you're the savior of humanity, but Half-Life 1 was not. These games are a representation, ultimately, of the experiences of their creators and the culture they live within. There is a level of individualism found within that wouldn't really appear in, say, Japanese games. There also exists the important impact of religion on the culture and how that culture, regardless of the personal beliefs of the developers, affected the narrative of the game. Halo has very strong religious undertones. Your enemies are a death cult bound by their worship of the ancient race that built these mysterious objects. There is also an aspect of humanism as well. Mankind are the only ones able to actually use Forerunner technology. Mankind are the chosen people, and as we know from history, the chosen people are waiting for a messiah to save them from their darkest hour. No, I don't think it's a stretch to say that Master Chief is a Christ allegory. Many great stories are a retelling of the life of Christ. Star Wars, Chronicles of Narnia, Lord of the Rings, and countless stories all through history are merely a retelling of this one. You see, we don't need to know anything about the Master Chief between games. You don't need to see his face. There's a reason he begins and ends the trilogy in a freezer, because he's not just a regular person. He's not someone with his own struggles. He's a legend, a mythological hero, an icon. The original Halo 2 storyboards indicate that Master Chief would take off his armor at the end of the game, but they decided not to do that any point in the trilogy. They even went so far as to ensure he was wearing armor at the medal presentation ceremony, even with the little nod to the fact.
You told me there wouldn't be any cameras.
And you told me you were gonna wear something nice.
Gordon is, similarly, a hero who appears when the world needs him most, when history, God, some kind of unfathomable force, requires the right man in the wrong place. He's literally pulled into the void by G-Man until he's needed again. The G-Man is a true mystery. Typically the term G-Man refers to a government man. He represents some kind of shady organizations. He's someone who represents the state. He certainly does look like the type with his suit and briefcase, but it doesn't take too much speculation to deviate from that. Maybe the G stands for something else. Maybe it stands for God. It's a representation of the hand of God in these stories. Your allies will follow you to their death. Even seeing you gives them hope. Your mere presence is enough to give people faith. You are the hero that appears when the world needs you. In both of these games, you have a remarkably similar journey. A seemingly unstoppable foe is built up. A genocidal alien civilization that vastly outnumbers and outguns you. An extremely deadly parasite that's caused the extinction of countless other races. Humanity is doomed and is saved at the last hours from the jaws of death. The name of the game is individual empowerment. You get to be the hope. All mankind exists because of your sacrifice. America is still largely a Christian country, so it's doubtless that these developers were consciously or subconsciously influenced by Christian narratives, where Eastern games are often about killing God. These seminal first-person shooters are about killing the false religion, only to reveal the truth. It is perhaps the ultimate expression of individualism. Where does our story end? Well, assuming we're in 2004 when the games actually released, they don't. Both games were plagued by the same issue, albeit for different reasons. They ended on cliffhangers. It seems that 2004 was the year of blue balls. In Halo 2, you got the famous line,
You mind telling me what you're doing on that ship?
Sir, finishing this fight.
Bungie ran out of time when they were nearing the end of development. Halo 2's development was notoriously difficult. They had the pressure on them from their publisher Microsoft and each other to make what was basically the largest video game release of all time at the time. It was one of the worst recorded cases of crunch in the video game industry. They basically had to throw out the entirety of their E3 demo. That includes the lighting and graphics engine. None of it could actually run on the Xbox. So much of Halo 2 was cut, like Forerunner Tank or Covenant Ship. Halo 2 was less than half of the game Bungie planned to make. It's almost a constant for Bungie. Get incredibly ambitious and overextend, realize it's not feasible, panic, and then fix it later. The padding sections of Halo 2, such as the gondola rides, are a result of the rushed development. It's very well known now that the story of Halo 3 was basically just an extended third act of Halo 2's story. The Halo 2 ending was notorious at the time. It was seen as blatant sequel baiting and left many fans with a sour taste in their mouths, having to wait a whopping 3 whole years for the conclusion. Halo 2 was criticized for its abrupt ending, but I feel that criticism has reduced over time. Yes, it was frustrating then, but Halo fans finished the fight over 13 years ago. They've had their conclusion. In Half-Life, you've got that line.
Time, Dr. Freeman? Is it really that time again?
And then the cliffhanger. G-Man grabs you as the core's exploding and puts you into stasis or the void or the G-Man's femboy gamer realm. You don't even find out what happens to Alex. The story, of course, continues in the Half-Life episodes. In episode 1, you're escaping the reactor. You're never really told how you escaped despite the explosion being right in front of you. Episode 2 ends on the death of Eli Vance at the hands of the Overseers. You get a glimpse at the Combine leadership and hierarchy through these chapters. But there is one major failing in both of them. There is still no conclusion. I think any joke you could make about Half-Life 3 has been said 1,000 times before. Valve never got around to making the game. Half-Life fans never got closure, while Halo fans did. Half-Life 2's development, similarly to Halo 2's, was stricken by setbacks. Although the level of crunch was probably not the same, or rather, it was less notorious. The game was delayed a whole year from 2003 to 2004. There was also the infamous beta leak that had a huge toll on the team. The game changed significantly from the beta to the launch. It was redesigned entirely. The tone of the beta leak and the tone of the final game were very different. Half-Life 2's development was much more of a long march, a process of technically refining the game over an extended period of time in a high-pressure environment. Initially, it was, like Halo 2, all about low pressure and lofty ambitions, but as the time ticked on, the bugs mounted up, there was going to be some squeeze. Remember the infamous line from Gabe Newell about the delay of Half-Life 2. When responding to a fan asking about the delay rumours, he said, "First time I've ever heard of this." It seems that Valve lacked the time to deliver a conclusion. Now, Valve has had the time to deliver a conclusion. Even if they did run out of time for Half-Life 2, they've had many years since. They did manage to deliver an interesting new take on Half-Life just recently, which retcons the ending of Episode 2, but again, has no solid conclusion. I think Half-Life fans deserve the conclusion. Epistle 3, the unofficial script released by Mark Laidlaw, the writer of the Half-Life series, is the closest thing we're getting to an ending anytime soon. After all is said and done, how do people perceive these games? I think the perception of both of these titles has fluctuated over time. I think the fact that both games are still being talked about is a testament to the work of Bungie Studios and Valve Software, respectively. Fashions change with the age, with the decade. These titles have been criticized for not being comfortable for modern gamers, for not conforming to whatever is in vogue in contemporary gaming, for not playing a certain way or having certain gameplay features that would make it easier for a modern gamer to join in. But they have, each of them, stood the test of time. At the time of release, Halo 2 received critical acclaim. It has a 95 on Metacritic, lower than Halo 1, which got a 97. It was almost unanimous praise, with a common criticism being its ending. There were also some fans of Halo 1 who were disappointed in the complete rebalancing of the sandbox. The pistol was much worse. There were more than enough people singing the praises of this game, giving it perfect scores. It was the biggest game release ever, at least by 2004 standards. Half-Life 2 was also the recipient of near universal critical acclaim. It received a 96 on Metacritic, matching the score of its predecessor. By the way, I'm using Metacritic not because it's necessarily the best indicator of the quality of the game, but because of how it gauges critical opinion. It kind of aggregates from different sources. Now maybe it's just my perception, but for some reason Half-Life 2 seems to have received a modicum less criticism than Halo 2 for its cliffhanger ending. Despite being basically just as unresolved at the time, at this point still having no resolution. Yes, critics definitely brought it up, but it was never really a huge deal. Half-Life 2 has a certain aura around it. Now, I know all fans of any game are gonna blow smoke around their favorite one, but the box art literally quotes a review saying it's the best game of all time. It's not so much that Half-Life fans present their game as the perfect game, cause everyone does that. It's the fact that they denigrate other games. Some people get legitimately offended when you dare to compare any other game to this perfect, sublime shooter experience. And this attitude represents every single Half-Life fan. Everyone who likes this game is just in an irrational hate mob. Of course, I'm joking. It's only a very minuscule vocal minority who act in this way, but I've definitely noticed it. There is an air of pretension when it comes to Half-Life, or rather when it comes to certain critics regarding Half-Life.
The thing is, Halo Reach sort of does stand up on its single player. It's not within spunking distance of classic territory, but there's nothing particularly offensive about it, and at least makes an effort.
Maximum PC gave the game an 11 out of 10. Or this one review that said, "The graphics engine is so realistic that you feel like you're participating in a movie." One writer from The Guardian, that's how you know it's going to be quality, said, "Half-Life 2 always felt like the European art house answer to the Hollywood bluster of Halo and Call of Duty. Martha, please readjust the stick within my anal cavity." That's another trope often presented by critics of Halo, lumping it in with Call of Duty. Beyond surface level aspects like regenerating health and 2-weapon limits, the design of Halo and Call of Duty are worlds apart. It's indicated by the myriad issues caused when aspects of Call of Duty were added to Halo. Call of Duty has just as much in common with Counter-Strike. Low time to kill, movement inaccuracy, weapons not being picked up off the map, small intimate maps, 3-lane design. The closest thing to Halo in the shooter genre is probably Star Wars Battlefront. I feel, however, that this perception has changed. The biggest catalyst obviously being the arrival of all of the Halo titles on Steam. People are starting to realize that no, Halo did not ruin first-person shooters. In fact, very few games directly copied Halo. What games are actually legitimate Halo clones and not copies of other games like Call of Duty? Haze, Chrome, Killzone? You'll find that there are very few games that poorly tried to imitate Halo and ended up sucking. The truth is, the wave of shitty modern military shooters had very little to do with Halo at all. That wave of shitty FPS occurred well after Halo was the top dog in the shooter market. The Medal of Honor remake, for example, released in 2010. These games often featured sprint, aim down sights, hit markers, loadouts, and several other features which Halo did not have. Halo did not have quite the negative impact it's often attributed with. Many people remember Halo as a game of the past. It was certainly huge for a time, but that time was about 9 years at most. Online, you'll see the broader gaming audience's knowledge of Halo is based on seeing the fans' wistful nostalgia for the better days. Many people have moved on from Halo. The Halo music is also influential among people who haven't even played the games. It's one of the most recognizable themes to this day. Halo is largely seen as a series abandoned by its creators and mismanaged by a team who had no knowledge of what made it good. Half-Life's greater cultural relevance often centers around its various in-jokes, most repeated among them being the fact that there will be no third game, and Valve can't count to 3, and all of that. The series does still impact the gaming industry today. Half-Life Alyx is recognized as one of the best games available on VR. VR, however, is and might always be a niche audience. Most people were just excited that Valve is making games again. Both Halo and Half-Life have dedicated fans to this very day, making brand new mods and experiences well after the original developers left them behind. People talk about the influence of Half-Life or Halo on the gaming industry, but I think it's just the beginning. People who grew up playing these games are just now entering the games industry. There has definitely been a wave of retro shooters as of late. I think, soon enough, we'll begin to see games inspired by Valve and Bungie's respective contributions. It's only then that we'll know they left their mark on the world. They educated their audience on what a game is meant to be. That is the cultural legacy of these two games. It's not just a matter of how relevant they are and how often they appear in TikTok compilations. Valve and Bungie, pioneers in the industry, have a remarkably similar journey. Valve was co-founded in 1996 by former Microsoft employees Gabe Newell and Mike Harrington. Half-Life was their first game. Gabe Newell was seen as more of the ambitious creative character, while Mike was the more pragmatic and business-oriented. Despite the success, or rather because of the success of Half-Life 1, Mike Harrington left the company in 2000. He claims to have been proud of the company he helped build, but had other dreams of exploring the world. He left Valve before they even reached their peak, commercially and critically. Gabe Newell is still at the company to this day, and, as a founder, is in a leadership position. He mostly seems to be interested in new technologies rather than just developing games. Valve is not publicly traded and is thus not beholden to shareholders or a board. Bungie was co-founded in 1991 by recent university graduates Jason Jones and Alex Seropian. Jones was the more creative and ambitious of the pair, coming up with many of the game ideas, while Seropian handled business and marketing. I just want to take a moment to say that Seropian sounds like the name of an enemy from a Bungie game. Seropian eventually left Bungie in 2004, around the release of Halo 2. He never got to see the peak of Bungie's success. Jason Jones, on the other hand, works at Bungie to this very day. Jason Jones is very much a recluse. This was noted by several employees. He went on a long break from game development after Halo 2. He is not a public figure by any means. The last appearance I could find of him was in an interview in 2017, when Destiny 2 launched. He is in a creative leadership position at Bungie. Bungie is not a publicly traded company, meaning they, like Valve, are not beholden to shareholders. Bungie and Valve have an interesting parallel history that aligns at so many points. They share a remarkably similar studio history. It really shows the duality of people in this situation. Perhaps it was just chance that two games happened to tap into the zeitgeist in such powerful ways at the same time. One on PC and one on console. Or perhaps it was some kind of force outside of our control. Perhaps it was destiny. At the end of it all, I think it would be a great disappointment not to give you, the viewer, an answer on this. Which one was the better game? I could go on all day about how it's not fair to compare, but in reality I think everyone has their biases. I could go through all of the objective measures like the engine and the physics, but ultimately that's only a fraction of why people love games. It's about the experiences you've had. Rating games is an inherently biased activity. To be honest, you could probably guess throughout the video which game I prefer. I think Halo 2 is the better game. You can see my reasoning for this all throughout the video series, but ultimately, none of that matters. I'm going to be biased by my own experiences. Halo was one of the first FPS games I played. It wasn't the very first though. I still have memories of playing through the co-op campaigns with my friends as a kid. I can quantify and qualify my experiences all I like, but it would ultimately be unlikely to change anyone's opinion. I am as biased as any other human being. I accept the fact that other people have entirely different experiences. There is no singular way to play and enjoy video games. Even within the confines of each game, there are countless ways to enjoy it. If you don't like the fact that a random person on the internet prefers a different game than you do, then that's on you. You're the one who needs to get a life. Besides the fact that I prefer the Halo series in general over Half-Life, I think Half-Life 1 is a better game than Half-Life 2. But you know what? None of that really matters anyway. What platform do you play on? Because that's the question that really matters. I want to thank you all so very much for watching and getting me past the line to 2,000 subscribers. I'm really hoping to start off this year well and get some real growth, so please subscribe and enable notifications if you're in any way interested in this kind of content. This video was kind of an ordeal. To be honest, I didn't plan for this video to take this long or be split into multiple parts. It's just that I started to write and I realized that there were so many things I had to cover. There were quite a lot of things I really couldn't ignore, and I had to keep adding different sections to talk about. Anyway, I'd like to thank you all so much for watching, and goodbye.